Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for Mr. James Lim. I agree that we must exercise and demonstrate compassion in policy making. And in fact, I think that is what the government has been trying to do in many of the policies. And as a result, sometimes our policies become very complicated because we understand that there's no one-size-fits-all policy that treats all problems. I have a specific question, and it's about minimum wage. I'm not sure I heard correctly. Mr. James Lim seemed to have suggested that the implementation of minimum wage can be implemented with minimal impact on unemployment. I beg to differ. I think under current times, where businesses are being challenged and we're in a period of recession, there is a very real risk that if we were to introduce minimum wage, a universal minimum wage across all sectors, I think many of our lower wage workers may lose their jobs. And from low wage, they become no wage. There are unintended consequences of some policies with good intent, but I think we must understand the context and the circumstances that we are in so that we do not unintentionally cause more distress to our lower wage workers. Thank you.
James Lim.
Well, thank you, M.O.S. Gan. It actually warms my heart that in this very House, others in the PAP ranks have in fact echoed a lot of these sentiments. Patrick Tay and Henry Craig spoke more about balance in foreign PMET hiring, Miriam Jaffa about discounting paper qualifications, Louis Ng, in fact, about compassion. So, in fact, you could even say that they have become PAP light, WP light, excuse me. And, the truth is I would argue that we should be able to think about implementing policies like a minimum wage in a time of crisis because this concentrates the mind. And I think that if we agree in principle, as I said in my speech, with the idea of a minimum wage, which is one step to the left, a half step perhaps, of the progressive wage model, in fact, that minimum wage policy, once we agree on that, can be easily rolled out after the storm has passed. So there's no doubt that at this very moment, such a policy may not be ideal, but let us come together and agree that this is a principle that we want to roll out so that when we set these plans in place, after the storm has passed, we can easily bring them to pass.
And where's Zaki?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a clarification on to Mr. James Lim's, Member James Lim's point about minimum wage. There is a fundamental difference between what we've come out so far, what the government has said so far with the progressive wage model versus the minimum wage. And this is not a new concept where it's just thought of just after the elections. So if you talk to the NTUC, members of NTUC, for example, they've talked about the progressive wage model since the 2012. And there is, in fact, a key difference between PWM and minimum wage in that it is differentiated across sectors. These are pains in which the union, the government, and the employers come to a position in what is bearable by every sector. So there is differentiation by sector. And the fact that there is a ladder also tells us that there is recognition that we want to bring workers to different productive levels too, to make sure that workers continue to upgrade, they get paid better. And we have seen the impact of the PWM models where in the last 5 years, our low-wage workers have seen wages rise by 30% in real terms. I think Minister Josephine Teo has already mentioned that in her speech. And the expansion of PWM is not something new that we talked about. In this House, in March this year, as part of the budget and COS, I too announced that we are looking at expanding PWM. And the reason why we take a bit of time, and you've seen how PWM has been implemented over the past few years, including the most recent one announced for the lift and escalator sector, is that we have to come to positions that is bearable, that is not just blunt tool, a straight line across all sectors, that you find employment being difficult for some. I mean, take the hawker assistants, for example. I mean, some are family-owned, some are members of the family helping each other, or their family businesses too, you have to think about. So there are different considerations and things that we have to work out across sectors. But it's not a new position. It is something that we've been working since 2012 to now. In fact, even before that, the union has already raised this, just that we've implemented them in stages. And something that we have already announced that we will expand beyond once times are better. The second point that the member also raised is that we have to talk about compassion. I think it's easy to talk about compassion when it's just mere talk, and when you're going to put money on the table, you've also got to consider as a government where that money comes from, how you manage the budget, whether you have to raise GST. And I think where the PAP government has made a difference is that we put the money where our mouth is. When we talk about compassion, we've just put up 4 budgets in the space of 3 months. What does that mean, $100 billion? I think many Singaporeans have also felt the impact of the care and support package. Job support scheme, I think, is one of the best forms of unemployment insurance to some extent, where you can see many jobs being saved during this period. So to some extent, there is a lot of compassion, but I think you have to realize that this is a whole system put in place. And I think the last part about, member talking about, 25% of our population are low wage. Can the member let us know what's your benchmark or basis of saying so? What is the definition of living wage or minimum wage that the Workers' Party subscribes to? And let us know what that number is. I think I would like to ask for clarification from the member what that number would be. And I think the last part about not recognizing what government has done. If you look at the low-wage workers today, beyond just wages and how we have helped both the industry as well as consumers, the people out there, is that if you discount the fact that the workfare comes to place where the government puts in revenues in which we transfer back to workers of low wage, and this translates into up to 30% of extra income for them, so that we bear the burden as a society, transferring back taxes, and you don't push this onto consumers, so that you also manage the level of inflations. But over time, as you've seen, wages go up through PWM, and we hope as we expand it, we get more workers on board. And I think what's also important is that you don't just work on the minimum. As you can see, different sectors, security sector earns more than cleaning, so why work on one level when they can work at different levels, making it relevant to the productivity and the levels of wages that each sector can afford. And so why just keep to a minimum? And last but not least, I think if you look at the proof of the pudding, is that among our low-wage workers, the bottom 20% of all our workers, about 70+% of them own their own homes today. So the transfers that the government gives, it goes beyond just wages, but it encompasses the whole system where I think a large part of our low-wage workers are given that shelter, that stability for their children to be able to grow up in stable homes, given the opportunities to rise. And many of us came from those kind of families too, to be able to be given good shelter, good education systems. And I think this all comes to play in how this government has been compassionate in its policies. Yes, we can do more, and I thank the member for giving us suggestions, and I hope that with our further debates in this House, there's more that can be done. Thank you.
Dr. James Lim.
Thank you so much for all those interjections. I thank the member. And let me just talk about a few of his points, because he mentioned quite a few. One, he talked about how there is a fundamental difference between the PWS and minimum wage in that it is differentiated across sectors. And that is, in fact, true. And that is, in part, why I anticipated that point in my speech and mentioned that this becomes, when you start to over-engineer a system, you run the risk that it can get gamed. There's a theorem, I don't want to get too technical, but there is a theorem in public policy making that when you are unable to hit your first best policy, it is very likely that your second best policy is going to be extremely different from the original. So you want to be careful when you try to over-engineer and try to squeeze out every bit of efficiency when you're working with imperfect knowledge about conditions on the ground. Now, the other issue with the minimum wage is that as long as you have the possibility that another sector has a minimum wage that is different from the first, you run the risk that there is going to be substitution between one sector versus another. That's our entire point. You want to shut out this possibility of substituting between workers in one sector and another, such that employers end up gaming the system in that fashion. So that's on that. With regard to real wages, it is true that median wages have risen in this country, and that is, in fact, a good thing. But unfortunately, national income has risen much faster. And as a result, in spite of this progress, think of it this way. Imagine that there is a pie, and the pie has gotten bigger. So I'm giving you a bigger slice of this pie, but it's still a much, much smaller slice of the pie than the kind of pie that other workers in other high-income countries are able to enjoy. Now, the member also asked me about where the low-wage study came from. I will just cite the reference. It is, I'm happy to provide the full reference, but basically it is a study from our National University of Singapore, which, so it's not my numbers. And I was heartened to see, in fact, that the Times Higher Education Supplement recently ranked NUS as a top 25 university, so globally. So I would be willing to trust their numbers. Now, he also talked about how we're actually, with the PWM and making it universal, it is something that is a step that has come closer to us. You know, I'm much more of an ideas person. So rather than looking at the cityscape, I tend to look at the policy landscape. And, you know, when I see that the incumbent's position is now closer to us, I say to myself, what a skyline. And I thank the voters for helping us to get a little closer. So final point, where does the money come from? Well, it's important to know, and this speaks a little bit to the debate yesterday in this House as well. We should not think about government budgets in the same fashion that we think about household budgets. Households have finite horizons. People can bequest things onto the next generation, but by and large, households eventually perish. Governments have an infinite horizon. And because of that, we can think in much more longer term. You see this very simply. There is the possibility that the government can oversave. And in a time where interest rates are at record lows, ask yourself, is it time for you, even as an individual, to perhaps remortgage your home? If you think that remortgaging with low interest rates are a good idea, that is about expanding leverage, that is about borrowing. So, if I may argue that what we want is to make the best use of financial resources and not cling to some rigid ideology that we should never touch. We are not just, the way we should think about expenses, such as our reserves, is not that we are people that we will spend the reserves. We are stewards, and as stewards, we are responsible not just for taking advantage, not just for ensuring that the pot will actually grow over time, but as stewards, we're also responsible for taking the right financial decisions, which in certain times may involve spending for higher investment things. And what are some of these higher investment things? Think about education. These are high return things that we can actually extract a higher return. So in the future, we will be able to get higher tax revenue that will more than pay for the expenses that we incur today.
Mr. Vikram Nair.
Thank you. I have two clarifications for the member. First, what is the level of minimum wage that the member proposes is appropriate for Singapore? And two, is the member aware of any countries with a minimum wage that have a lower unemployment rate than Singapore? Because I think that'll be a good case study for us. Thank you.
Dr. James Lim.
Thank you. Mr. Nair, let me clarify two things. The first is what is the appropriate level of the minimum wage? I should be clear. I do not know, and that is exactly why what we need is a national commission to understand this and to study this. And that would be what, if I would ask for a practical policy proposal, I would argue we should have. We should have an independent panel, and in fact, that panel should continue to exist year after that minimum wage policy is rolled out, because that will allow us to continually evaluate whether the level of the minimum wage is actually appropriate. It should be independent, it should be staffed by university professors as well as representatives from both the unions as well as firms. So it should be, our famous tripartite arrangement. And it should be filled with these people to better understand what is a good level and to adjust. We are a pragmatic country, a pragmatic policy-making nation, and so we can adjust accordingly. Now, as for countries with different levels of unemployment, I think it's imperative for me to clarify that we don't want to be comparing raw unemployment rates across countries willy-nilly. But what I'll say is this: the basis for me to argue that minimum wage has a very limited impact on unemployment is premised on reams and reams of studies. It's not my own, but studies within the economics profession that have repeatedly shown that in almost every instance, the unemployment impact is either very minimal or statistically insignificant, such that it cannot be detected in a regular statistical test. So I should be clear that when I talk about the absence of an unemployment effect, I'm not using theory to make this argument. It is based on empirical evidence which has been backed by studies from countries all over the world, not just in high-income countries.
Ms. Timpeling.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member, Mr. James Lim. I have a few questions. First of all, it's more to clarify my understanding. May I first confirm if it would be accurate for me to interpret that based on Mr. Lim's response to MOS Gan Xiao Huang, is that you do recognize that implementing minimum wage in a climate like this will have unintended adverse consequences on our economy and as well as our employment? Secondly, can I also confirm that by his response, he meant that the minimum wage can be implemented after the crisis, and then should a crisis hit again, it should be withdrawn, and then implement again when it's in a good time, and so on and so forth. And by that, how might it be more efficient? The third question is that I understand, based on his Honourable Member's response to Honourable Member Vikram, is that there is no specific number that you have in mind in terms of minimum wage. Perhaps to give us a better idea is that for your town council, what is the minimum wage given to your cleaners? I think that would give us some form of reference. And the last question is, I can feel your passion about youth and Singaporeans. So may I ask if you have a specific proposal on how to improve youth employment in Singapore? Thank you.
Mr. James Lim.
Thank you, Ms. Tien, for that, for those questions. Let me just take them each at a time. So the first is whether I think that I agree with Member Gan that rolling it out would have adverse consequences. No, I did not say that. It was a necessary but not sufficient condition. I did say that this is not an ideal time, but I do not know if we were to roll out the minimum wage, whether this would result in actual adverse consequences. So it is a necessary but not sufficient condition. I personally, I do not necessarily think that rolling out the minimum wage is a good time, but I would not go the second step of saying that it would imply adverse consequences. That's the first point. The second point is whether we want to roll in and out of the minimum wage. In fact, I would argue the complete opposite. The whole point of something like a minimum wage is to provide that kind of social safety net. If you were to roll out the minimum wage at the time when you are in a crisis, that would pull the rugs out from under those workers that rely on the minimum wage in the time of crisis. So that is an absolutely wrong-headed way to go about implementing this policy. In terms of the town council, well, as you know, we are in the process of taking over the town council, so we have not made decisions on the minimum wage for the town council. But let me take the more general spirit of the question. Can we just roll out a minimum wage in a given town council? No. And again, this comes from the fact that you have general equilibrium effects. If we were to roll out the minimum wage in only one sector of the country, what will happen is substitution, and what will happen is you will have the low-wage jobs actually migrate out of a given country. So you want to be very careful. What you want is an across-the-board universal minimum wage to apply to the entire country. And that is precisely why I think that is the way forward. And at least insofar as the PWM is concerned, I would agree with the notion of universality. And then finally, about youth unemployment. Now, this is tricky in part because youth unemployment tends to be very cyclical. So when you have unemployment, especially by the youth in a crisis period, what happens is that is often a reflection of a decision to delay entry into the labor force and to end up taking more education. So that is, in fact, you actually see an increase in unemployment in a time such as this when we're in crisis, but it's actually not a bad thing. You want these people to actually go in and build up their human capital.
Mr. Speaker, a point of order, please.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. James Lim was asked a question. While I appreciate his erudition in economics, and I'm learning quite a lot from him, he hasn't answered Ms. Tin's question.
If I may clarify, which question did I not answer?
Ms. Tin asked if he had a proposal for youth employment, not the principles under which youth employment changes or doesn't change.
Yes, but why that context is important is because we want to not have these we do not want to roll out youth unemployment, specific proposals to address youth unemployment in a time when we are in a recession, because we are not sure if the unemployment is justified or not. So that's the reason for me stating that context. So I do not have a specific policy in mind because I have not thought about it. This is a very slow 8086, if that kind of dates me,
okay, thank
processor.
you. Mr. Sito Ipin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. As an accountant, I'm rather perturbed by something Mr. James Lim said just now. If I heard you correctly, you said, given the low interest rate, it is now time to remortgage your properties. As an accountant with over 3 decades of experience, I can tell you that is how people start getting into trouble. I hope you're not teaching that in your classes, but to my knowledge, Singapore is one of the very few countries in the world, maybe the only one that hasn't got to borrow in such pandemic times. Having a balance sheet is good. Having savings is not a sin. Having savings like the way we have it is very good. So may you clarify on what you just said? I hope I heard you wrongly. Thank you.
No, in fact, you did not hear me wrongly. That is exactly why I mentioned the distinction between a government budget identity and that of a regular household. Governments have an infinite horizon, and so it is entirely possible for governments to oversave. So I use the mortgage situation just to illustrate the point that there are instances where if you borrow against low interest rates and you invest in something that would give you higher returns, that is not just financially prudent, it is in fact going to be better for your balance sheet in the long run.
Mr. Sito Ipin.
So if I may say, that is living in a stage of euphoria. You are always assuming that tomorrow will be better than today. I don't want to go into an argument about economics here. You said because of the low interest rate, I mortgage and then I reinvest to get a better return. You are assuming there is a better return which may never come.
Oh, no,
Mr.
no.
Leon Pereira.
So one clarification. No, I'm not assuming a better return. I'm saying if there are projects that give you better returns today, you should engage in those, substitute out from the low returns that are already locked in by your ability to borrow at low interest rates. So it is not assuming a future euphoria. It is recognizing that there are higher return projects today, unless you're saying that the youth of today in Singapore are not worth investing in.
I don't think that was the point that was made. Mr. Leon Pereira?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to seek some clarifications from MOS Zaki, MOS Gan, and Mr. Vikram Nair about what they have said. So I'll start with MOS Zaki. I would like to put it to the Honourable MOS that based on parliamentary questions that we have asked in the last term, if you take a wage level of, say, $1,300 per month, the number of people who are earning that wage right now is approximately 100,000. It could be a bit more, it could be a bit less, but that's my inference from answers to PQs that we got earlier. Now, let's assume it's 100,000, earning less than $1,300 per month. In response to a separate parliamentary question that we asked, what is the average household expenditure on basic needs? We asked this of the government, I believe, in 2019, and the answer came back $1,300 per month. When a similar question was asked by my colleague, Mr. Gerald Giam, the answer was $1,250 per month. If I recall correctly, that was a number of years back. So $1,300 per month is the AHEBN, and that excludes transport. There's no equivalence between the two. Of course, there could be dual income, triple income households. But for those earning $1,300 per month, I assume that not everyone would be covered by the progressive wage model. I think that's a reasonable and fair assumption. The MOS and others have said that the progressive wage model is going to be rolled out to more sectors. But my question to the MOS Zaki would really be, what would you say to individuals earning less than $1,300 per month who are supporting a household which is below the AHEBN that the government itself has specified? Do you believe, does the MOS believe that there's no room for policy improvement for this group? Should this group wait until the progressive wage model comes to them? How long will that take? How many years will that take? Is there no room for improvement? And what would the MOS say to those individuals? That's my first point of clarification. My second point of clarification is to MOS Gan. I would like to invite the MOS to agree with, and I think Professor James Lim did make some of these points earlier, that there is a considerable body of academic research that suggests that if a minimum wage is set at a level that is not too high, and there are various definitions that have been postulated by academics. I know there is a figure of 40% of the median and so on. You know, if the minimum wage is not set too high, it will have a minimal or negligible impact on jobs. There is actually quite considerable academic evidence for this proposition. And I would like to ask MOS Gan, would she consider that actually the danger to jobs is not setting a minimum wage, but setting a minimum wage too high, which is definitely not what we are advocating. And my third clarification is to Mr. Vikram Nair, who asked whether there is another country that has a minimum wage and has lower unemployment than we have in Singapore. I'd like to ask Mr. Nair, would he acknowledge that other countries who have higher unemployment than Singapore, it may not be causally because they have a minimum wage, and if we have lower unemployment than those countries, it may not causally be that it is because we do not have a minimum wage. Thank you.
SM Taman.
I wasn't intending to speak, and I just thought I'll make a very brief intervention. First, I would like to say, on behalf of the government, that we do believe that it is important to raise the wages of our lowest paid workers. We really believe this. We've achieved significant progress in the last 10 years and in the last 5 years, and we think we should go further. I would not, and I say this to everyone from all sides, I would not exaggerate the differences between the PWM model and the minimum wage model. The PWM model is a minimum wage plus, and it is a sectoral approach. And the sectoral approach actually has a lot to commend it because it allows you to set the minimum rung at a level that is not so low and not so high. Because if you have a single level, you'll have to decide where to pitch it. how to do it without having gaming is an issue that policymakers grapple with. Not such a complicated issue in practice, to be frank, and you have to watch what happens at the edges. But it's a very sensible approach. I would like to suggest that none of us have a monopoly over compassion. And I say this not to discredit anyone. And in particular, I really respect where Member James Lim is coming from, intellectually, emotionally, and so on. But don't assume that, no one should assume that you have a monopoly over compassion. I've listened to speeches over the last few days amongst everyone. I must say some of my PAP colleagues really made an impression on me, not just for the very forceful proposals they were making, often going beyond what the government is doing, but the force of their conviction and the emotional force of their conviction. So please don't assume, none of us should assume, I'm not directing this at anyone in particular, none of us should assume that we have a monopoly over compassion. Also, and here's a bit of advice, try to avoid strawman arguments, like saying that the government is only interested in efficiency and not equity. That's frankly laughable. By the way, I say straw man, should I say straw person? But women aren't made of straw, I think. So, well, let's stick to straw men. But try to avoid that manner of argument or painting everything in binary terms. It's usually not necessary to reply, but I say this as a piece of general advice. Raising the standard of living of the poor is a complicated matter. And I say this, by the way, as an economist, as someone who studies overseas experience very carefully, and who, together with my colleagues, is a practitioner. How do we do it without losing that wage earner's ability to have the pride of having a job and earning a wage? We do it through the progressive wage model, which has to be expanded. We do it through workfare. We do it through a range of other subsidies, whether it's KIFAS, the housing subsidies, and many other ways. And it's not a job that's done for good. We have to do more. And many of the speeches that we've heard in the last few days were about how we can do more in a way that really helps those we're trying to help. But we are frankly not very far away from each other in that objective. In fact, we seem to be quite convinced. I mean, there is a consensus, let me put it that way, that should be our objective. But just try to avoid strawman arguments and pretending that you have a monopoly of in compassion. And by the way, as a very small point, I've never heard economists cite a university as a source of research, be it a well-regarded or not very well-regarded university. Individuals do research, and maybe very credible research, but universities don't publish research. Thank you.
May I?
Dr. James Lim?
Yes, so very quickly, I regret if it came across that I was suggesting that only I or the party or any individual has a monopoly over compassion. In fact, that was explicitly why I did cite cases where I felt that existing policy demonstrated oodles of compassion. I even cited other members who have, not from our party, that have also talked about compassion. So I actually believe, like Minister Tharman does, that there is in fact quite a bit of daylight. There is not as much of a gap between the thinking of the two. Now, that said, I don't think that I was setting out a strawman argument in talking about an efficiency-equity trade-off. And the reason for this is because this is precisely a continuum. So I'm not suggesting that every policy that is currently in place is only geared toward efficiency. And likewise, I'm not suggesting that every policy that I have laid out in my speech and elsewhere is only geared toward equity. Rather, it is about a continuum. And I am arguing that we can move more in the direction of favoring equity over efficiency. And that was the entire point of the argument, not to create an artificial straw man.